Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Friday, 23 February 2024. It is the 141st anniversary of the birth of Karl Jaspers, who was born in Oldenburg, Germany on this date in 1883. Jaspers is widely considered to be, along with Heidegger and Sartre, one of the three founding fathers of existentialism, though all of three of them rejected the label of existentialism at one time or another. Many of Jaspers' works are concerned with history, often in the form of a concern with contemporary history. So, Man in the Modern Age was originally published in 1931, translated in 1933, so only a couple of years later, and revised in 1951. It takes the present and its distinctively modern problems as its point of departure, and it announces several themes that we would now call existentialist. But Jaspers himself called it, or preferred to call it, existence philosophy. So here's a passage from near the end of the book. Existence philosophy is the way of thought by means of which man seeks to become himself. It makes use of expert knowledge while at the same time going beyond it. This way of thought does not cognize objects, but elucidates and makes actual the being of the thinker, unquote. We think of existentialism today as something like an abstruse and abstract philosophical engagement with immediate and pressing issues that influence the individual. So it's kind of like, as it were, a sublimation of personal interests into the abstract language of philosophy. If we wanted to be unsympathetic, we could call it a rationalization of navel gazing. Because when thought doesn't cognize objects, but elucidates and makes actual the being of the thinker, we've turned away from outside engagement with the world and toward inward engagement with the self. Gilbert Murray might have called this another failure of nerve, and I wouldn't be surprised at all if somebody has used that phrase to describe existentialism. Probably someone has. And it is the antithesis of dispassionate inquiry. By making one's passion the point of entry into an inquiry, as well as the object of the inquiry. And I think from a theoretical perspective, this probably isn't a good idea. You could make a case for understanding a given age of history through understanding the man, but I'm not sure the existentialists did make this case. This approach could also be used to illuminate Collingwood's philosophy of history, which I discussed yesterday on Collingwood's birthday, in which history is the history of thought, and the task of the historian is to reenact past thought in the historian's mind. But if we focus on the historical situatedness of the individual in his own age, and how the thought of that individual elucidates and makes actual the being of that individual thinker, then our thoughts today, even if they are thoughts of the past, are elucidating and making actual our situation in the present, and not some past situation in history that's now been lost to us. We could take this as an existentialist refutation of Collingwood, as a Collingwoodian refutation of existentialism, or again, as an opportunity to reconcile the two, because both Collingwood's idealism and Jaspers' existence philosophy as applied to history run into trouble with the objectively existing world outside our thoughts. But they run into slightly different kinds of trouble, so it might be worth seeing if the two complement each other, as it were. This short book or essay, Nietzsche and Christianity, was based on a lecture that Jaspers gave in 1938, translated in 1961, so well after it was published as an essay. It is largely concerned with Nietzsche's conception of history, so the whole thing is quite relevant to philosophy of history. And it is difficult to tell in this book where Jaspers' exposition of Nietzsche leaves off and where his own voice and his own commentary on history is to be heard. But here is an interesting and representative passage. The absolute view of history, as it were, a total knowledge, has beclouded our reality. It dominates vast areas of modern thought. It takes a jolt to free ourselves from it. The deliverance is easier in theory than in accomplishment, unquote. The theme of absolute history appears many times in Jaspers, but I haven't figured out exactly what he means by it. At times, a historical absolute is a form of totalitarian, while at other times it is a pursuit of unity and wholeness. Near the end of Jaspers' The Origin of Goal of History, he says, the totality of history is an open hole. So we could take this open hole as something frightening, like Pascal gazing into an abyss next to his armchair, as Voltaire put it, or as something open to possibilities and freedom, which is how Jaspers puts it in his The Origin of Goal and History. And we find that same ambiguity in this passage here that I just quoted. And you would think that an existentialist philosophy of history would want to jolt ourselves free from an absolute view of history as a totality. And probably someone has tried to do that, but I don't think that clearly happens in Jaspers. As I said, he sometimes seems to suggest totality as something that he is pursuing. In this book on Nietzsche and Christianity, Jaspers' critique of Nietzsche's critique of providential philosophies of history is often very perceptive, and his formulations of the providential philosophy of history being critiqued are quite clear and helpful, and can help us to understand other providential philosophies of history. So clearly, providential philosophies of history are a pursuit of unity and wholeness. They're also inspired by the supernatural, but it's the supernatural metaphysic of providential history that gives us gives the unity and wholeness of history and allows us to see history as a whole. Jaspers argues that, quote, Nietzsche's view of world history stems from Christian motives drained of their substance, unquote. This is similar to a criticism that Max Scheler made in a moral context. Scheler argued that Nietzsche's critique of ressentiment was itself motivated by Nietzsche's ressentiment of Christianity. And it's also similar to Karl Lovis' critique of philosophies of history as secularized eschatologies. Though Lovis didn't focus on Nietzsche, he focused his critique on Enlightenment philosophies of history. And Nietzsche is, if anything, the antithesis of an Enlightenment philosophy of history. It could be argued that Nietzsche is a figure of the counter-Enlightenment, and as such, he can be assimilated to the Enlightenment as an internal critic. And therefore, Nietzsche's philosophy of history belongs to the progressivist philosophies of history of the Enlightenment, regardless of appearances to the contrary. I don't think this is a good argument, but I think the argument can be made. I think a better argument can be made for taking Nietzsche as his word, but now be that as it may. Jaspers, The Question of German Guilt, was published in 1947 with an English translation the following year in 1948, is a very prescient work because it proposes a problem that has only gotten larger with time, which is the problem of historical guilt. And this is a topic that deserves its own exposition because of the significance it has assumed in our time. Since the Enlightenment, and we were just talking about Enlightenment philosophies of history, which we still live within, as I've said before, we live in the intellectual structures that were created by the Enlightenment. Since the Enlightenment, we've come to view ideas of inherited sin as something primitive and superstitious that we have long ago transcended. But the idea has only grown since the Enlightenment, but is never presented in terms of inherited sin. It's presented, like Lewis noted, as a sublimated and secularized eschatology. The kind of historical guilt that Jaspers prevents could be considered a secularization of inherited sin, just as the inevitable failings of human beings, which we now see naturalistically, could be understood as a secularization of original sin, with original sin being itself a form of inherited sin, perhaps the most comprehensive or generalized conception of inherited sin. Again, the specter of Karl Lewis hovers in the background because we could take the approach of Karl Lewis' meaning in history and argue that contemporary naturalistic conceptions, whether of guilt or of anything else, are secularizations of traditional theological conception. But that isn't Jaspers' way. Jaspers gives us a taxonomy of forms of guilt. I think they're moral guilt, political guilt, and he ends with metaphysical guilt. And he builds that up in an interesting way. The Future of Germany was written in 1966, translated in 67, once again, right away, translated a year after it was printed in Germany. I would call this a period piece intended to be timely, and note this timeliness of Jaspers in contradistinction to Nietzsche's making the case for being untimely. And this book has an afterword in it that's written in the very next year to discuss the elections in Germany in 1965. Though it's largely free of any speculation on the larger issues of Germany and Europe, which would be very interesting today in terms of where we know Europe has come since 1966. So the book is deeply embedded in its contemporaneous context. And I call it a period piece, but there's probably more going on. It's probably unfair to call it a period piece as much as it is that. It's other things as well. Jaspers is acutely conscious throughout this and throughout his other books on his contemporaneous history that there's a historical order that's embodied in the present that could always suddenly and catastrophically, anytime, anywhere, break down. And this ever-present threat of chaos is, for Jaspers, something like a threat of the repeat of the Second World War and its disasters. I think the deeper theme of The Future of Germany and other similar works by Jaspers in which he's considering the present condition is his own attempt at a philosophical atonement of the kind he proposed in The Question of German Guilt. The metaphysical guilt of the survivors of history, which is all of us alive today, can never be fully expiated, which ought to be enough to make us suspicious and to submit the idea to a deeper analysis. The Future of Mankind, which was published in Germany in 1958, translated in 61, is larger in scope than The Future of Germany. I would still argue that it is something of a period piece, but it discusses what Jaspers calls the new reality or the new fact, which is the reality of atomic weapons and the possibility of humanity being able to exterminate itself by way of nuclear weapons. Quote, "The threat of total extinction points to thoughts about the meaning of our existence. The atom bomb cannot be adequately comprehended as a special problem. Man can prove equal to it only if his true self responds to the chance at hand. If he treats the matter as one among other difficulties, he will not master it," unquote. I mentioned this book several times in my episode on the bombing of Dresden earlier this month. It's probably even less justified to call The Future of Mankind a period piece, since the use of atomic weapons made the idea of existential threat palpably present to us. Arguably, Nick Bostrom's conception of existential risk is the ultimate fruit of these kind of meditations on what Jaspers calls the new fact. Jaspers' most systematic work on philosophy of history is The Origin and Goal of History, published in 1949 with an English translation in 1953. It introduces the idea of the axial age, which has gone on to have a career well beyond philosophers. It's like the idea of a paradigm shift. It's had its origins in philosophy, but is used in a much wider way now. And Jaspers is trying to find a formulation of something in history that is universal to the human species. I would call it an attempt at a planetary scale history. There's also quite a bit in the book about the historical situation of the present, as with earlier books I've been mentioning. And there's quite a bit about the philosophy of technology in this book. I haven't heard anybody else mention that, but quite a bit. Jaspers does have quite a bit to say about the philosophy of technology, but he's rarely mentioned in that connection. But technology plays a significant constitutive role in the historical situation of the present, so we shouldn't be surprised to find it there. The book ends with a chapter called Overcoming History, in which Jaspers writes, "We are seized by a feeling of dissatisfaction with history. We should like to force our way through history to a point before and above all history, to the matrix of being, before which the whole of history becomes a phenomenon that can never be right in itself, to the point at which, sharing knowledge with the creation, so to speak, we are no longer entirely at the mercy of history. But for us, the known Archimedean point can never be situated outside history. We are always within history, in forcing our way through to that which lies before or athwart or after all history, into that which comprehends everything, into being itself. We are seeking in our existence and in transcendence what this Archimedean point would be if it were capable of assuming the form of objective knowledge," unquote. So there's lots of back and forth in this passage. We're seeking a point outside of history. We can't find it. It's like we're positing an ideal Archimedean point outside of history and doing a thought experiment of what if we could locate this point, what it's going to be like. I'm not sure if that's a productive way to approach it, but it's an interesting way to think about it. Despite his many reflections on the problems of the present age, and the vocabulary of crisis runs throughout Jaspers. Jaspers is not a pessimist. And in this Reason and Anti-Reason in Our Time from 1950, translated in 52, he has this to say about reason. "Even when the worst prognosis of decline is made, reason refuses to accept it. When all the probabilities of the historical situation have been taken into account, The average qualities of the myriad human race and the slavery and self-oblivion that have marked such great stretches of the human story, reason still considers the forecast of ultimate catastrophe uncertain. Practical experience of unexpected favorable outcomes of apparently hopeless situations makes a deep impression. They are no proof that the same thing will happen again, but they are, as it were, a guide for reason in its basic attitude, and to endure the tension, not to reckon with a certain future, to be conscious of the constant threat of disaster, even in the most favorable circumstances, but not to overlook the range of possibilities in what may appear to be the most hopeless situations, and above all, to keep hoping, in any case to live, taking all the intellectual precautions possible, and to decide one's course of action as conscientiously as may be within the limits of the possible in the activity of production, like the peasants of Mount Vesuvius who bring their glorious fruits to maturity under the constant threat of all-engulfing lava." Unquote. So there we see several motifs already familiar from what I've quoted from Jaspers about the ever-present possibility of catastrophe. But along with the ever-present possibility of catastrophe, there's the ever-present possibility that there might be a decent outcome nevertheless. And I think when Jasper wrote that, practical experience of unexpectedly favorable outcomes of apparently hopeless situations makes a deep impression. I think he could well have said that it made a deep impression on him. And despite everything that goes wrong in history, mostly human beings muddle through and make a life for themselves. So happy birthday, Karl Jaspers, and thanks for listening.